So hello everybody, could you hear me? Okay. I'll try not to make you feel asleep or bored. I know that this is at least for me, this is the most difficult time just after lunch. And I'm going to be reading quite often. English is not even my second language, and I know that I have only 20 minutes, so I want to be concise. So basically, I'm going to present, let's say, a proposed study. I mean, it's an upcoming study in which I'm working. The title is Art, Social Space, and Play. So it blends in different areas, different fields of knowledge. And the subtitle is The Role of Play in Socially Engaged Art Practices. As we see here, the art is not present, and hopefully through this presentation we will get back to the art. So, but first of all, I would like to start with a quote by a Dutch architect, Van Eyck, who was in the States during the 60s and who wrote a book about the city, the child, and the artist, in which he blends basically ideas of how to approach space, blending in the physicality of space, the exploratory learning of the children, and also the imagination dimension of the artist. And it goes like that, the quote. I think that it was probably written in the late 60s, but I feel it's kind of very actual, or very actual, that's present? Okay. So it goes like that. Instead of the inconvenience of filth and confusion, we are now getting the boredom of hygiene. The material slum has gone, but what has replaced it? Just mile upon mile of organized nowhere. No microbes left, yet each citizen a disinfected pawn on a chessboard, but no chessman. Hence, no challenge, no duel, and no dialogue. So basically, my research question is how does play manifest in the creation of a socially engaged art project? And if so, what role or what roles does play have in making possible the ideas, practices, and outcomes that shape a socially engaged artwork? So, for the past 14 years, I've been involved in artwork centered in cities and public space, primarily as an artist, also as a curator and as an art educator. And soon, my projects evolved into long-time projects and were shaped by the specificities of a place and of the community I was working with. And this shift was based on my gradual understanding of space, and in particular public space, as a terrain that is shaped by social, historical, and economical dimensions, along with the growing interest in a more diverse public, and by incorporating their perspective and experiences into the artwork, into the making. Not to mention the pleasure, and I would like to emphasize this word pleasure because this is very much connected to the idea of play, of working in collaboration with other artists, professionals from other fields, locals, etc. I incorporated more clearly the dimension of play in some of the artworks I produce, such as Barcelona Ciudad, in which we play soccer in the streets of Barcelona as a means to produce moments of sociability and interaction with passerby, checking the physicality of the city, but also checking the regulations imposed at that time in Barcelona's downtown, which, among many other things, prohibited the spontaneous, let's say, sportive practices. And at the same time, while involved in the production of other art projects that didn't specifically address play, there were many moments in which I felt immersed in the bliss of conversations and actions with participants, something that is very much connected to the idea of playfulness or to a particular state of mind. And simultaneously, while I was involved into that bliss in the making, I always felt concerned with keeping track of the goals, keeping consistent aesthetic component, the visual documentation of the work, something that I relate also to my educational practice, like how to integrate the creative efforts of students and at the same time keep track with the curriculum. So I want to share with you basically the way I approach this research, something that I call the spirit, attitudes, and dispositions that we could say it's a sort of a set of rules that I impose to myself while approaching to research. So basically, the first of these rules would be that if one is to research on play, one must be guided by sheer curiosity. One must be opened to unexpected detours, findings, and possibilities that didn't exist before, something that might be connected to Mindy's insistence on failure, probably. And also, yet, one must abide the rules of the game, meaning that one has to follow the methodological, the methods of the research. Another aspect that I find pertinent in view of my background is go naive. And I take that basically in relation to the expression of going native by ethnographers. And when I say that one must go naive, I'm saying that one must be willing to abandon oneself, to abandon the certainty of one's past experiences, background, and also to suspend temporarily the literature that has addressed these areas and embrace the not knowing as a driving force that paradoxically leads to generate new knowledge. So basically, I forgot the last one said one must be willing to inhabit paradoxes. Paradoxes are a space where we can really learn and where I really find fun. No? In that sense, paradoxes would be, like in Dewey's word, would be like an invitation to try rather than an obstacle to be hurdled. So the paradoxes I'm facing while doing this research is how the seriousness of the social issues with which socially engaged art deals meet with the apparent lack of seriousness of play. And I'll probably address that later on. The second one, I mean, there are many more, but I'm just summarizing 3 of them. How the socially engaged art agenda, in other words, its emancipatory goal, meets the apparent aimlessness of play. And the third one would be how the socially engaged art modes of production that look like social interventions in real life meets with an apparent symbolism of play. So basically, I'm going to now show like the 3 main areas that I'm interested. So social space, social engaged art, and play. The frame in which I look at space is very much informed by French scholar Henri Lefebvre, who, among others, set up a new perspective from which to study space, which is basically centered on the concept of praxis, of practice. Space, in that sense, cannot be understood in isolation of the social domain, as it is precisely produced by interactions, relationships developing in it, such everyday practices, walking. We have seen that, I think, yesterday in one of the presentations. And we could say that space, because of that, is fundamentally social. It's produced by a society, and in turn reproduces society, which in turn leads us to understand it as a place of learning. The same Lefebvre, I think it's in 1970, he says precisely that streets should be a place where we play and where we learn. And place of learning, obviously, here refers or is very much connected to Ellsworth's understanding of public space as a learning space. So basically, sorry, I'm going to go back. I'm going to show some images. I'm going to talk about some of these images, others no. So basically, based on that frame, of Lefebvrean frame, we can say that it leads to an understanding of a space that is something constantly actualized by its inhabitants, something that is not only the recipient of our actions, but also something that organizes and shapes the form in which we make meaning of our environment, of our reality. Derived from this conception, there seems to be significant implications for both the field of art and of education, since it allocates opportunities to imagine, act upon, and transform our lived environments, and eventually society. So here I summarize a little bit what anthropologists, geographers, sociologists involved in the study of space have identified as emerging phenomena in cities' public space. Basically, we could say that, in one hand, public space is gradually commoditized. There seems to be a curtailing of citizens' freedom of access and appropriation. And for appropriation, I understand, like, not ownership, but having a free use of space, deciding how to go through it. So it seems that there is a curtailing of citizens' freedom to access and appropriation of space. And in that sense, the meaning of public space would seem to be prescribed to citizens through regulations, through design policies, instead of allowing the free exploration, interpretation, and appropriation. Also, to this atmosphere of consumerism, we must consider the scenario of fear under which public spaces are currently designed. Under these circumstances, the sense of public space as a democratic space, a place of learning, seems to be gradually eroding. Public space is fenced, barricaded, designed to favor social control. Under this scenario, public space become what the Dutch architect I introduced at the beginning calls the boredom of hygiene. That is, the design of a clean and safe public space that sets in advance the experiences one may have by entering in it. So within this context of boredom, there is the emergence of socially engaged art practices developed in public space, practices that are understood as a political endeavors since they mind the actual scenario of rights being curtailed, social as they address social issues and pursue the betterment of society, and educational as they create opportunities for experiencing other forms of being together, other forms of relation with the others and with the space, and for obvious reasons, aesthetic. So to that scenario, so we can say that there are the artists who are intervening in those spaces. We have to consider also the individuals' movements, appropriations, imaginations that constitute what Michel de Certeau, another scholar, calls another speciality, which leads to understand public space and as a creative space or as an alternate space. That's what art educator Richardson was proposing, and as a place of learning, following Ellsworth's words. Artists have not ignored these forms of creative resistance by individuals, by citizens. An example of this is the work La ciudad jubilada by the artist Pau Faus from Barcelona. In his project, he seems to invite the public to reconsider the statement of retired. La ciudad jubilada means the retired city. And basically, he's documenting the activities perpetrated by seniors, retired people, in peripheral spaces in Barcelona, retired spaces, that has been dismissed as an active force of production in society. So the other domain is socially engaged art. Here, again, as I did with public space, I put some adjectives. So one of the main characteristics is that it's interventionist. So it's an art of presentation rather than of representation. It seeks for face-to-face relationships with the public. It seeks to transform, impact the spaces where it happens. It's participatory in the sense that it solicits at some level the public's participation. And there is a gradual interest by artists to work, for example, with what Thomas Hirschhorn, the artist, calls the non-exclusive audience. So that is an audience, a public that is not the one we would expect in galleries or in museums. And one of the other main characteristics is it has a very important stress on the process rather than the final outcome. So it's experiential, and it would lead to what I've been calling the shared experience, in the sense that it's an experience that it's shared, it's mutual between the artist and the public. So, alongside the socially engaged art stress on the process of creation of this shared experience, rather than the final outcome, I would suggest that this situates the negotiation between the artist's goals, conditions, and expectations, and the actual development of the artworks among participants in a realm of uncertainty, of unexpectedness. It is a desired uncertainty which I understood to be in close relationship to play. Art educators have seen in socially engaged art the potential site for experimental and emancipatory education. It has been argued to be a form of critical pedagogy as it contributes to audience emancipation, as anomalous pedagogy because of the unexpectedness of the socially engaged art locations and means. Also as a form of radical pedagogy as it questions the received institutions and assumptions. Trans-pedagogy, and we could add more and more, and eventually we could add also playful pedagogy. Ooh, I need to fly. Okay, play. So play, we would say that I consider play in two forms. In English, you have two words. One is play and the other one is game. In my mother language, in Catalan, we only have one. And I like the idea of having one because it refers both to a sort of state of mind which would correspond to the playfulness, whereas game, it's something that is basically designed through rules, or it's manifested through rules and probably sustained by space, whereas playfulness tends to resist that idea. So in Catalan, we have everything, and Spanish as well, all together. In French, I would say so. So here, for example, socially engaged art, Nicolás Dumit Esteves, an artist from the Bronx, he used here deliberately the theme of play for this project called Playdate, which is basically based upon the erasures of rules. He invited people to play, to slide down through this typical rock at the Bronx. And basically, I'm gonna try to go faster. Okay, and basically, I participated in that project, which confronted me to the challenge of what to do, what to expect, as the project is basically it's precisely based upon the erasure of rules, habits, and practices that we usually associate with adult life and with public spaces. So these are some of the characteristics of plays. I will move fast to the other one. Artists also have addressed play not only as a theme, but also it can be understood as a vehicle that favors social grouping. It helps creating and sustaining a community, in generating, reconstructing social space, but also as a vehicle that sustains participation. For example, a record for Pelestrina, the artist Gloria Sefontria et altri, employed the figure of a record to engage the inhabitants of the island of Pelestrina in the Venezia Laguna in the art making. And all together, they created the biggest lace in the wall, which represents the island characteristic perimeter. Not to mention that by doing that, they engage with one of the vernacular forms of expression in that location. So I will go fast. The type of study, here I'm combining three, it's basically a 6-case study within an ethnography, but I'm using also image-based research and collective inquiry. I'm going to be working with 6 artists and mostly interested in how their forms of engaging with a specific community, with a specific space, can inform and assist an art education that is responsive to the current states of affairs. By that I say, out of time. By that I say the current state of affairs. I'm saying that the same, what we have seen in public space, this kind of necessity to prescribe even the meanings or the experiences one might have when it enters one of space, we can also see that happening in the schools. I would like to show. So we have the testing, standardization, assessment, that is falling over the students and the teachers, which might lead, again, to this idea of apathy, boredom, and somehow to a kind of disconnection of students of the curriculum and of the educational environment. So what I propose here is socially engaged art practices that have some kind of playful or play component to invigorate, to transform these spaces. And I would like just to end up with this idea. Play cannot be solely addressed from the perspective of a pleasurable and enjoyable experience, not from the perspective of its symbolic nature, but instead play needs to be understood as a crucial element in humans' growth and potentially, and that's one of the aspects I'm mostly interested in, is as a source of transformation of our living environments. And here are some of the anticipated outcomes to which I would probably add tool of learning, obviously. Thank you.
I mean, I can go if you want, or do you want to go?
I guess so.
Right.
I think you mentioned it just briefly in when you were talking. This idea that I'm interested, are people resistant to the idea of using play with adults, of the terminology play? You hit briefly in there about something about adults and the idea of play. I just wondered if you had more to say about it.
So there's a lot of literature regarding children and play.
Right.
And what interests me is precisely the diverse public with which artists work with. And I'm very interested in this mixture of adults, youngsters, seniors. And from my experience, I would say that probably the play element, that's something that we all have still, and that maybe may constitute a sort of repertoire that it's within ourselves. And that through the art, this can emerge and become a source of transformation, a source of knowing oneself, knowing also the environment and knowing the others. So I'm very interested in this idea of play and adults, because apparently one would say that as we grow up, we tend to forget, we tend to forget playing.
Right.
I mean, when I participated with Nicolas in his work, Playdate, at the beginning I felt helpless, and I've addressed play in many of my works, but I still felt helpless because I didn't know what to do. We become so used to have like the strictures of adult life, workload, whatever, family, that we tend to lose that.
Yeah, I think when you first started talking about play, I of course expected you to start talking about young children and play. And so I think it's really interesting to think of this idea as, does it take an arts intervention to get adults to play?
From my perspective, yes,
Yeah.
I've seen that.
Yeah.
I've seen that. People that are 60, people that are 70, but mixed together with people that are 20 and 30.
Why do you think it is? Do you think it's like you guys are already breaking the rules so they can join right in, or?
Breaking the rules. Well, I think I would say that probably, in essence, we still have that playful drive in ourselves, and that's how we get to know our environment. But also, there's this bliss of transgressing the social social, how would you say, order, right? And I think that through these art practices, it becomes, it's a facilitator. I mean, while I was doing research in a pilot study, I was working with one of Lorenzo Romito. He's one of the members of Stalker, an Italian arts collective. And they use play basically to engage with the community, to get to know each other, and to see what happened, and if eventually this might lead to a project or not. Right. So it was through play, and in that case it was probably used as a tool, as a strategy to engage, and also to build a community. And it was adults. It was a community of adults. There was no child. But I think that it's important nowadays that we are somehow with the standardization and everything, and also like how space is designed as a flat surface that you go there and you can easily read it and know which kind of experience or what are you supposed to do in it. I think it's important to step back a little bit and to try something more, and that for me is bringing the play element to it.
Thank you for your presentation. I think it was really interesting. I have a couple questions, but I think I would be interested in hearing you talk a little bit more. You talked about like the emancipatory goal of socially engaged art and the idea of like public space primarily being like, talking about like social control, like in a public space, and what it means to view that space as once people have experienced that space as like a space of play, is there any way in your experience that they're able to continue viewing it that way, or is it just like when the event is over, when the play is finished, does it automatically slide back into its form?
That's a good question. I think that it's really hard to track that, but I think that it might constitute a resource that oneself can develop later on in a similar situation. So meaning that after one of these interventions, it doesn't mean that the public automatically will be acting in a space in a very particular way, but I think that it constitutes a resource. It constitutes, of course, a learning experience for that.
Because I was also thinking about that in conjunction when you were talking about like not divorcing play from like this pleasure idea, this fun, and sometimes like experiencing something once is a lot of fun, but then if it's like you're forced to do it again and again, it has its own sort of.
Yeah, then I mean, of course, there's an element of temporality.
Yeah.
It's very ephemeral, the moments of play or playfulness. But I think that, yeah, they remain as a resource. And with regards to emancipation, I would basically use Freire, who said that, like basically, and thinking of one of the presentations we saw today, in order to stop, or let's say, how can I phrase that? Like this banking style of education. I wouldn't, probably memorization, it's really harmful. But probably what's most harmful is that it basically stops creativity or doesn't allow creativity, imagination. And that's where possible transformations or imagining oneself and therefore acting upon our own conditions is possible. So I don't know if I have responded to your question.
That's good. Interesting. Thank you.
Is that enough?
We have time for one question. Any questions? All right.
I'll take it. Yeah.
All right, take it.
So I guess it's kind of stupid obvious, but like, so why does it have to be art? Like, why? I'm sorry. So, and I know this is like art education, like we're all here because we, this is one of our core, areas of focus. But I'm just kind of curious, your focus on sort of playfulness instead of games. And I actually see that, in terms of thinking about the adults in your focus, as that's a huge outlet and capacity in which adults choose to express playfulness is through games and through actually structured play. So I'm kind of curious if that, I just want to, I guess, trouble that. And are there artists who are actually playing with structures of games that might also trouble that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. There's a difference in which children play and the ways in which adults play, in the sense that probably in adulthood it becomes something more structured, something that has a more clear purpose. But I'm not that sure when it comes to playfulness. I think that this is probably a state of mind, that it goes across all the ages. And with regards to your question about why incorporating art or not, I would say that this pertains to I've chosen socially engaged art, though today we could talk about social practice, and we could use also like interventionist art, and we could talk about many other labels. I keep with socially engaged art, basically following Pablo Olguera, artist and art educator, because it still keeps a reference to the art world, and at the same time, it makes clear the desire of being an in-between space, like the social domain and the art domain.
Thank you.